Rope is probably the most important thing humans have ever invented that almost nobody has ever bothered to think about. Look around whatever room you're in right now. Screens, engines, refined metal, chemicals most of us cannot pronounce. What you will not notice is that almost none of it could have been assembled without something to tie, lift, pull, bind, or hold. Rope is the technology that quietly made the other technologies possible. Its reward for this is being considered boring, which is a little unfair because rope is not obvious. Hand a modern adult a pile of dry grass and ask them to produce something strong enough to hold their own body weight. Most would fail, repeatedly, and loudly. They would end up with a handful of shredded grass and a new respect for their ancestors. Rope is not lying around in nature waiting to be picked up. Vines exist, and vines are useful, but a vine is not a rope. A vine dries out, snaps, rots, and is whatever length and thickness the plant happened to feel like growing that year. Rope is manufactured. It is a deliberate and genuinely counterintuitive act of engineering, and it is performed on materials that are, individually, completely pathetic. And humans had already worked all of this out at least 50,000 years ago, although possibly not the humans you were expecting. To understand why rope is impressive, you have to start with how weak its ingredients are. Take a single fiber from the inner bark of a tree, pull it, it snaps almost immediately. Take 100 of them and hold them together in a bundle, and you have improved things only slightly. A loose bundle still fails, because the fibers slide past one another and share the load unevenly. Pull hard enough, and they peel apart one at a time, like a very slow disappointment. The trick is not the fiber. The trick is the twist. Twist that bundle in one direction, and something quietly remarkable happens. The fibers press against each other. Friction increases. They can no longer slide freely. A load applied to any one fiber is now quietly shared across all of its neighbors, and the bundle behaves as a single object. But a single twisted bundle has a problem. It wants to untwist. All that stored tension is trying to escape. So you take 2 or 3 twisted bundles and twist them together in the opposite direction. Now each bundle's desire to unwind is fighting the other bundle's desire to unwind. They lock. The rope holds itself together using nothing but its own frustration. That is the entire secret. Counter-rotation. Twist one way, ply the other way. There is no glue, no knot, no fastener. Just geometry and friction doing all of the work. Spinners still name the 2 directions after the diagonal stroke in the letters S and Z. And that principle has not changed in 50,000 years. The steel cable holding up a suspension bridge is doing exactly what a Stone Age grass cord was doing. It is simply doing it with better materials and considerably more paperwork. Now the second problem. What do you actually make it out of? For most of prehistory, the answer was bast, the long, tough fibers hiding in the inner bark of certain plants. Linden, willow, elm, nettle, hemp, flax. Also grasses, palm, papyrus, and a surprising number of roots. But you cannot simply peel bark off a tree and start twisting. The useful fibers are cemented to everything else by gums, pectins, and the general structural ambition of the plant. So you have to separate them. And the traditional method for that is to let the whole thing rot. Carefully. It is called retting. You soak the bark in water, or leave it lying in wet grass, for days or sometimes weeks. Microbes eat the soft material binding the fibers together, and mostly leave the fibers themselves alone. Stop too early and the fibers stay glued. Stop too late and the microbes start eating the fibers as well. This is controlled decomposition, judged by feel and smell, with no timer, no thermometer, and no instructions. Then you beat it with a wooden mallet, scrape it clean, comb it straight, and only then do you have something worth twisting. Which means rope is not one invention. It is a sequence of them, and most of them are invisible in the finished product. Somebody had to work out which plants were worth harvesting at all. Somebody had to work out which season produced the strongest fiber. Somebody had to work out how long to let it rot before the rot turned against you. And somebody had to work out the twist, and then teach it to a person who had never imagined it. None of that was written down anywhere. All of it had to be remembered, and repeated, and passed on. There was also an animal option, and early humans used it constantly. Sinew, the tendon running along an animal's back and legs, separates into fine white fibers of extraordinary strength. Wet sinew is soft and flexible. As it dries, it shrinks and hardens, gripping whatever it was wrapped around. That makes it superb for binding a stone point to a wooden shaft, which turns out to matter enormously. There was rawhide, which behaves similarly, and gut, and hide cut in one long spiral to produce a single continuous cord. Different materials, identical idea. Take something floppy and weak, and organize it until it is strong in the direction you need. So we know how rope is made. The harder question is how we know that anybody was making it. And here, archaeology runs straight into its oldest and most frustrating problem. Rope is organic. Organic things rot. That is essentially their whole job. Stone tools survive for millions of years because stone does not care. A cord made of plant fiber can vanish completely within a few decades under ordinary conditions, which means the archaeological record is not really a record of what ancient humans made. It is a record of what happened to be indestructible. Stone survives. Bone sometimes survives. Fiber almost never does. Everything soft, woven, tied, or carried has quietly deleted itself. So we are reconstructing an entire technology from the handful of occasions when the universe was careless enough to leave a receipt. Fortunately, the universe has been careless a few times. And the most surprising example comes from a rock shelter in southern France called Abri du Maras. In 2020, researchers reported a fragment of cord still stuck to the underside of a stone flake found there. It was about 6 millimeters long. You could lose it inside a fingerprint. Under magnification, it was unmistakable. 3 bundles of fiber, each twisted one way, then plied together the other way. 3-ply cord, exactly the counter-rotation principle, made from the inner bark of a conifer. The layer it came from is dated to between roughly 41 and 52,000 years ago. And at that time, in that place, the people making those stone tools were not us. They were Neanderthals. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it quietly rearranges a lot of assumptions. The oldest direct physical evidence of rope making that we currently possess was not made by our species. It was made by a species that spent most of the 20th century being used as a casual synonym for stupidity. A species we drew slouching around dragging clubs, and which was apparently spinning 3-ply cord. It is one small fragment, and one fragment is one fragment. We will come back to that. But it is direct, it is physical, and it is very difficult to explain any other way. There are other clues, and almost all of them are accidents. At Ohala II, a waterlogged site on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, twisted plant fibers survived roughly 23,000 years. They survived because the site was submerged, and water starved of oxygen is remarkably bad at rotting things. At Lascaux, in the cave system famous for its painted animals, fragments of twisted cord were recorded in 1953. They had lasted roughly 17,000 years as a peat-like residue and an impression pressed into clay, and they have since dried out and been lost. The frozen man found in the Alps carried bast cord, a bowstring, and netting. 5,300 years ago, he survived because he froze, which is a poor outcome personally, but an excellent preservation strategy. Waterlogged, sealed in clay, frozen, or bone dry. Those are essentially the only 4 ways fiber ever reaches us at all. And then there is an object that may be evidence entirely on its own. At Hohlefels in Germany, archaeologists recovered a carved piece of mammoth ivory between 35 and 40,000 years old. It is a flat rod with 4 holes drilled through it, and every hole has deep spiral grooves cut into its inner walls. The excavators interpreted it as a rope-making tool. Feed fiber through the holes, twist, and the grooves help control the strands. If that reading is correct, it is not evidence of somebody making a cord. It is evidence of somebody building a machine to make cord faster, which is a thought that should stop you briefly. That is a different level of commitment entirely. That is a person who expects to need a great deal of rope. Experiments have since made real rope using a replica, which helps, but objects with holes in them have been confidently called a lot of things over the years. But it is at minimum a serious candidate, and it fits a much larger pattern, because there is one final category of evidence, and it is by far the biggest. It is everything in the record that only makes sense if rope already existed. A stone point is useless on its own. It becomes a spear the moment it is bound to a shaft. That binding is cord. Every hafted tool ever excavated is indirect evidence of fiber technology. A bow is just a bent stick until it has a string, at which point it becomes the most important weapon on Earth for 10,000 years. A net is nothing but cord arranged with discipline, and a net can feed a village in an afternoon. A fishing line, a snare, a carrying bag, a child's sling, a fence, a shelter, a raft lashed together at every joint. We almost never find the rope itself. We constantly find objects that could not possibly have functioned without it. The absence is the evidence. So where does all of that leave us? With several genuinely open arguments, and no comfortable way to settle them. First, how far back does this actually go? 50,000 years is the oldest direct fragment we currently have. It is almost certainly not the oldest rope. It is the oldest rope that got lucky. Those are 2 very different statements. The cord from Abri du Maras is not a clumsy first attempt. It is a competent, consistent, standardized product. Technologies do not usually appear fully formed, which implies a long history behind it that we simply cannot see. How much older? Nobody honestly knows. Perforated shell beads, strung on something, go back at least 140,000 years, but a leather thong would do that job just as well. Second, and far more contentiously, what does that cord tell us about the mind that made it? The team who published the Abri du Matas fragment argued that it implied a working grasp of pairs, sets, and numbers. You have to track several bundles at once, hold consistent tension, and deliberately reverse direction at the right moment. That is the most speculative paragraph in the paper, and it does not really follow from the cord. Skilled repetitive craft can be learned by imitation without any explicit mathematics at all. A very good weaver is not necessarily doing arithmetic. They are doing something that reliably works. 6 millimeters of cord is a very small foundation for a very large claim about somebody's mind. Third, was rope invented once, or many separate times? Almost certainly many times. Usable fiber grows nearly everywhere that humans have ever lived. The problem it solves is universal. The materials change from region to region, but the twist does not. Rope is less like a single breakthrough, and more like fire. Too useful, and too available, to belong to one moment. Fourth, and least satisfying of all, what actually counts as rope? There is a continuum from a handful of grass held together, to a twisted strand, to plied cord, to braided rope. The first person to twist two fibers together was not wondering which category they had just entered. They were trying to make something hold. The categories came thousands of years later, invented by people who were not doing the twisting. Which brings us to what genuinely changed, because rope did not stay a convenience for very long. Rope is a force multiplier in the most literal sense the phrase allows. It lets a small amount of muscle apply a large amount of force somewhere else entirely. Run a line over a branch and you can lift far more than you could ever carry. Wrap it twice around a post and friction quietly does most of the holding for you. Rope moves effort across distance and around corners, which nothing else in the entire Stone Age toolkit was capable of doing. It also solved a problem that sounds trivial and absolutely was not. How do you carry things? Human hands are excellent, and there are only two of them. A bag, a strap, a sling, a net. Suddenly one person can move a day's food. Or a child, and keep both hands free. Foraging range expands. Group mobility improves. Infants can travel without occupying an adult entirely. Over thousands of years, that is not a small effect. It made composite tools possible, which may be the single largest consequence of all. Before binding, a tool was one material, shaped one way, doing one job. After binding, you could combine the hardness of stone, the reach of wood, and the strength of fiber into one object. The spear, the axe, the harpoon, the bow. Every one of them is an assembly, and every assembly needs something holding it together. It made travel by water possible. Rafts are lashed. Sails are rigged, anchors are tethered. Every prehistoric sea crossing implies fiber somebody was willing to trust with their life. And later, when people began moving stone blocks heavier than houses, they did it with rope, timber, and an unreasonable number of volunteers. Which raises a question worth asking. Why does something this important feel so completely invisible? Part of the answer is preservation. We built our picture of prehistory out of stone, because stone is what survived. So we named the entire era after it, the Stone Age. As though that had been the point. The archaeologist and textile historian Elizabeth Wayland Barber called the alternative the string revolution. Her argument was that fiber technology may have reshaped daily life as profoundly as stone tools ever did. It simply left almost nothing behind for anyone to name it after. You cannot build a museum wing out of things that rotted. There is a second part to that answer, and it is rather less comfortable. In most documented societies, fiber work, spinning, netting, weaving, and cordage has been disproportionately the work of women. Perishable technology, made largely by people whose labor was already under-recorded, is an extremely efficient way to vanish from history. That is not a claim that men never made rope. It is a claim about which kinds of expertise we chose to preserve and name. So here is where the evidence actually leaves us. Somebody, at least 50,000 years ago, looked at a bundle of useless fibers and did something strange to it. They twisted it one way, then twisted it back the other, and produced a material with properties none of its ingredients had. Nobody understood coefficients of friction. Nobody was calculating stored torsion or tensile load. They knew that if you did it this way it held, and if you did it that way it came apart in your hands. And crucially, they remembered. And they showed somebody else, and that person showed somebody else, and so on, without interruption, until today. That is the entire mechanism of human technology, running quietly for tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote a single word down. And rope is still doing it right now. In your shoes, in your clothes, in the cables holding up the bridge you drove across this morning without looking, in the thread stitching together very nearly everything you own. It is the oldest continuously used technology we have, and it has never once been improved at the level of the idea. We only ever found better fibers. The twist itself was already right, 50,000 years ago, first time, and nobody has ever needed to correct it since.